Hello, I'm Robin and welcome to Molten Modular. Today we're looking at the AudioScape Engineering Eurobuss. Now I've decided to do this video again. I did this already, went through the whole thing, but I'm not entirely sure that I nailed it exactly. There was a few comments I had where people were really misunderstanding what the thing was all about, and I don't think I got absolutely everything right all the way through. I mean, everything is subjective, isn't it? So I thought I'd give it another go. I'm not so arrogant as to assume that I can just kick videos out there and assume that they're all completely perfect. Good Lord, no! No one has any idea what we're doing. No, instead, I'm going to give it another go. I'm going to walk through it, going to check it out, I'm going to feed it some sound, going to squash it, going to make it up, going to attack it, release it, ratio it, those sorts of things, so that hopefully we can get a fuller flavour of what the Eurobuss is about. So, by way of introduction, essentially, the Eurobuss is the compressor drawn out of a classic British console. Back in the day, when SSL were making their classic G-series consoles and other series consoles, exactly, they whacked a compressor right in the middle. This was not a channel compressor, there were those things as well. It wasn't designed to craft an individual kick drum or to work on vocals necessarily. Its concept and its idea was to slap itself across either the mix bus or a large bus of some sort. Your percussion bus, your drum bus, your guitar bus. Hence the idea of it being a bus compressor. So AudioScape Engineering have taken that idea and already have a rack-mounted bus compressor, VCA bus compressor, which can provide that exact console-based scenario. However, somebody asked, would it be at all possible to have that in Eurorack form? And they said, yeah, all right, why not? And so we have the Eurobuss. Now, this is inevitably going to be different. While it's the same technology, it's the same stuff that's going on, the actual usage of this has to work within a Eurorack workflow, and that's what I'm particularly interested in. Now, I'm well aware that I could have a mixing console and I could route buses out of that, through that and back in again. But that is not the scenario in which we find ourselves. For the majority of modular musicians, I would suggest you are working with a rig, which is an instrument unto itself with multiple channels of sound, all being mixed together in different weird and jiggery-pokery different ways. So you've got a little mixer over here, a little mixer over here, and all of that is kind of coupled together to go to your master out. So while the Eurobuss comes from the world of pro audio, Eurorack is not so much that field. You've got noise, you've got terrible crackles going on, you've got terrible voltages, a rubbish power supply, a bad environment. Nothing about Eurorack is pristine or perfect. However, that doesn't mean that we can't use professional and interesting tools like the Eurobuss, because absolutely we can. But we just have to work within our paradigm. So I'm not going to be routing this out through things and back through things and buses and bits and pieces. I'm just going to be whacking it across the master output, because that is really where this thing is going to do its most work, is going to be its most awesome, and is actually potentially going to be helpful to us as a modular musician who's wanting to capture a performance from the rig. Now, if you're the sort of modular musician who has everything running out through separate channels into your DAW for mixing and processing and dynamics and individual channel compression and mixing and so on and so forth, then this is probably not for you. Do it all in the DAW, that's fine. But if you are the sort of person who's coming out of a single output, who's doing all of this stuff, mixing all of these incredible sounds together and then just going to a stereo output, then this perhaps could be really interesting. So before you all jump in and say, well, that's not how you use a compressor, that's not what it's about, don't worry. The great thing about compressors is that you can use them in any way you like. You can, right? There's no rules. You can just stick stuff in it, twiddle knobs, and see what comes out the other end. You can do that. You can release yourself from the expectations of what sound engineers tell you should be doing. But all I mean is that we're just going to stick some stuff through it, and, and don't panic. It's okay. We don't have to know absolutely every single detail. So I'm going to run stuff in, run stuff out, change a few settings, see if you can discern what it is that's going on, and hopefully at the end of this video we'll have a clear idea as to whether this can be useful, because that's all we really want to know. Can it be useful? Because compressors are not commonplace within Eurorack. There are a few about. There's a stereo compressor from America Synths, there's the Ghost and Golden Master from Endorphins, there's the Cohesion from Modular. Those work very well within the Eurorack structure because they are designed to do so. They fit in there perfectly and know what it is that they're doing. The Cohesion in particular works really well because it has this sidechain ability to pull that mix out of itself and then inject its own kick drum through that gap. Quite extraordinary, but very, very tailored and designed and curated to do exactly that. With the Eurobus, you're having to work to create these things yourself. You're going to have to use the sidechaining which this has in order to pull things away, in order to mix through somehow some kind of kick or other reason that you're using the sidechain. So there's work to be done. It's not hand holding you like some of the other modules do. This is serious stuff, and to some degree you're going to need to know what you're doing. Or do you? Well, to some degree. To some degree, and of course you're welcome to comment on how little I am knowing what it is that I'm doing. So I've worked up a bit of a patch, a lot of sound, and I'm going to use that as the example of stuff that we will flow through this. So I'm going to bring you in, we'll look at all the different bits, we'll try some bypassed and compressed comparisons, we'll change a few knobs and switches and see what that does. I'll try to run just some percussion through it so we can hear that as an alternative. We will do some threshold CV manipulation. I'll compare it to the G series compressor I have in my SSL BigSix, and then we'll have a bit of a talk and a chat about it. That's the plan. That's the plan, I think. So I'm going to bring you in nice and close. We'll focus in on this. Perhaps headphones at this point might be good because, it's really difficult to do proper audio discernment through YouTube, because YouTube's going to compress the hell out of the audio anyway. But with a little bit of imagination, hopefully we can tell and see and hear and experience what it is that's going on. Right? Good. Let's get on with it. First things first, let's just have a look at this, because it's quite a chunky module. Look at the state of that. Many boards fudged together in order to give you this glorious module. So it's very deep. It's about 5 centimeters deep, I think. And also the power cable comes directly out the back, which means you lose even more room, potentially. So it doesn't fit inside all of my cases, but however, it does fit in this Bafaka one rather nicely. So the Eurobus, to take you through what we have on the front panel. You have the threshold here. Now, if you're not very familiar with compression, what the threshold does is it sets the point at which compression begins. So everything that goes above the threshold is compressed, is brought down. So actually the process or the purpose of a compressor is to bring down the higher levels to a lower level. So it's actually a quietening device, bizarrely, because we usually associate compression with making things louder. The reason for that is that you tend to squash the signal so there's less dynamics, less peaks, it's a bit more middling, but then you turn it up with the makeup gain knob here. And some people say that, oh, if you're just making things louder, then what's the point? Well, I would argue that if you're making things louder and it's not distorting and it still sounds nice, then that's an achievement in of itself. However, compression, or a compressor of this nature, is designed to do more than just make things louder. It's designed to, as I say, bring those peaks down to give you a more even overall sound. And what's particularly good about the bus compressor from those old classic consoles is that it had this way of just making things sound good. Now that has no qualification to it whatsoever, but that is what we find. There's something in that element of squashing those signals. There's something in the circuitry and the way this is put together that just seems to bring this magical ingredient that people often call glue. it's kind of a cohesion. It's sort of a way of flattening things out so that it gives space to some things and allows other things to breathe while preventing other things from sort of taking hold and dominating. So it's a great way of flattening things out to give everything the maximum amount of room to be heard. I digress. Over here we have attack and release. Attack in milliseconds. So if you have a very short attack, that's going to squash everything as soon as it comes in. As you increase the attack, it's going to allow the transient, so that first part of like a drum sound through, and then compress the rest of it. So that's going to be interesting to play with. Release is in seconds, is a longer thing, and that sets how long the compression goes on for before it searches for another peak. Something along those sorts of lines. So playing with those two is how you you massage the compression into doing what you want to the audio signal. Then you have these switches in the middle. You've got the ratio. The ratio is how severe the compression is. You've got various different sort of on a graph of compression. You've got 2, 4 and 10, sort of 10 in 1, 4 in 1 and 2 in 1 being the most severe compression. In the middle you've got an auto switch. This is for auto release, which is a feature of those early consoles, and sort of takes care of the release for you depending on the state of the audio coming in. Underneath you've got a bypass, very, very handy. I absolutely approve of bypasses, very, very good. And then you've got a SCHPF, which is a sidechain high pass filter. And what that does is when that's switched on, it allows audio beneath about 160 Hertz to come through unfettered, unfiddled with by the compression, so that you don't lose that sort of bottom end, the subs and bits and pieces. And I have to say that's pretty effective. I really, really, really quite like that, as you will see. And then you've got 3 inputs down here. You've got sidechain left and sidechain right, because you can treat the left and right side of this compressor separately, which is interesting. And you've got an input for the threshold, CV control over this knob is the idea. Now that's a little weird, but we'll look into that too. Then you've got your stereo input and output at the bottom. Simple, right? So I think what we'll do is I'll just run the patch through for a few minutes, stick it in bypass to start with, and then I'll bring it in, and then I'll swap things in, swap things out, and see if we can work out what it is that this thing is doing. So this is in bypass currently, so I'm just going to play with a few settings just to give you a flavour of what the patch sounds like uncompressed. Okay, so that's it in bypass. I'm going to switch it in, but then we're going to need to work on it a little bit to try to get the balance right between the bypass and the compressed version. So what we're looking for is something like between 4 and 8 dB. And you want to get the level comparative between the two. Let's do that. Okay, so they're about the same, roughly speaking. So let's experience a little bit of that as I play with the patch with the compression in and then swapping between the two. So this is in. Okay, that should hopefully give you a flavour. Now let's change a few settings and see how that affects the compression that we're hearing. So attack and release. auto release. Ratio to 4. Ratio to 2. So what I'm finding works best for me, for my ears, for my enjoyment of this process, is have the ratio on about 10, possibly 4, but overall on 10, the attack all the way up to allow, as I say, those transients through, and the release just, wherever feels about right. That seems to work for me. Okay, let's talk about the sidechain high pass filter. So currently I've been using it with it in because that's really genuinely how I prefer it to be. Let's take it out. So with it out, the compressor has to work that little bit harder. The compression is greater. It's now dealing with the entire frequency band. And it feels lighter somehow. Something has been lost. I think. Switch that back in and you get this flooding in the bottom end, which might not be something that you want. Who knows? But for me, I really like that coming in. Let's just concentrate on the rhythm section. There you go. There you go. That's a mixture of changes and switches and comparisons and bypasses and bits and pieces that I hope gives you some idea of perhaps what it is that this is doing. To my ears, I'm thoroughly enjoying leaning into this compressor as I'm playing, as I'm changing, as I'm altering and messing around with the patch. I'm absolutely feeling the way that the dynamics are being pushed and being squelched. I'm feeling it kind of in my gut, the way that it's moving and changing. It's not the same as when it's in bypass. In bypass, it's good, it's steady, it's nice, and all those sorts of things. But when you switch that compression in, it just, everything gets slightly fuzzy, but in the best possible way. Everything is being, it's just being smoothed and smudged, and there's a certain amount of energy which is coming through it that just seems to pulse and emanate from itself. It has an extra character, it has an extra life, dare I say it. It has glue. Maybe. Hey, let's compare it to the G series bus compressor in the BigSix, which I have right over there. Now, the one in the BigSix is supposedly, modelled again on the same piece of console compression technology by SSL directly within their own bit of hardware. Now, it's not the same. Of course, it's not the same, but it's an approximation of it. So I thought it'd be interesting just to swap between the two to give you a comparison. So here's the G series bus compressor all the way over here. Just got two knobs, threshold and makeup. It's got auto release and an in button. And I want, for the same, around about the same compression, I'm looking at getting this to light up on the 6, I think. So if I bypass the Eurobus, put this in. Take it out. Eurobus. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's an interesting comparison. I mean, there's definitely something there in the bus compressor in the BigSix. It definitely has a feel to it. However, I kind of feel that the Eurobus, it has more to it. There's more going on. It feels like there's more energy being infused into the very being of the module in its circuitry, in its components, in its bits and pieces, that you kind of feel the very movement of energy within the Eurobus. More so than in this one here. Both sound nice though, I have to say, nothing wrong in that at all. But the Eurobus is definitely, for my ears, doing something more, bringing something extra to the table. Right, let's now look at the threshold CV. Now when I made this video before, I couldn't seem to get it to do anything, but having worked on it a bit more, spending a little bit more time experimenting, I did get it to work. The idea for this input is that you can put CV control over the threshold knob in order to do, I don't know, interesting modular things. I don't think AudioScape Engineering are particularly sure as to what it is you might use it for, but presumably somebody said, hey, could we have CV control over the threshold? And they went, sure. And so that's what we have. Let me try to show you what that could mean. So I've got an LFO coming out of the Batumi here. I'm going to run it through the molten motion meter in order to attenuate the signal a little bit, because that seems to be useful. And I'm going to jam that into the threshold CV. Now that tends to be what happens. Is it just throws it all the way over to the right. And this is when you've got to try to, massage it into being. So threshold knob itself, you would have thought would be some kind of offset, but isn't. Doesn't seem to have any effect at all. What you have to do is take the release down to its minimum, and then you start to get something going on. For the attack, that seems to need to be all the way up. The release all the way down. If you put auto on for the release, the needle just disappears over to the right again. But if you put the ratios down to 10, that seems to be when you really start to capture something. I turn it up a little bit. So the only way to sort of stop it throwing the needle all the way across is to attenuate it before it gets there. So instead of a sine wave, I could use a square wave. I try to bring the attack back, it just starts losing it all the way over here. So you kind of just have to deal with the sort of the relative slugginess of it. Put in a random. There's a certain amount of momentum or gravity involved in the needle or in the threshold. It's sort of being pulled about, but it drags as it goes. It's not an instant from here, there to everywhere. It's working the circuitry really quite hard to achieve what it's trying to do. It's not an instant flicking about type of compressor. question remains, really, is that interesting? Sort of, it kind of is. There's something in there which you can control. Maybe an envelope would be a better choice of modulator. Who's to know? Okay, the last thing to fiddle with is the sidechain. So the idea about this, I mean, you can use sidechains for anything, the same as you can use a compressor for anything. However, most commonly you use a sidechain in order to sneak the kick drum through. The idea being is that you throw the kick drum sound into the sidechain, that triggers or pulls down the compression, which brings the rest of the mix out of the way to let the kick drum through. That's the idea. Now it takes a little bit of sort of audio routing shenanigans to make that happen. That's why something like the Nobular kick cane is really, really good, because it has all of that built in, because it has the kick drum built in. As you trigger away the compression and trigger away the rest of the mix, the kick drum is right there to go through out of the same output. Using something like this, you're going to have to rig it up so that your kick drum is not in the same mix that comes into the compressor. It's in a separate place. So I'm going to have to think about think about how I do that. So for the sidechain, what I've done is I've isolated the percussion, calmed the patch down a little bit, taken out the plasma voice, which is just creating a little bit too much at the minute, so we can hear what's going on. I've got the Omnitone Beatsy just up here providing the kick and the snare, and that is now routing through the outside of everything else. I've got all the synth stuff coming into here, and the percussion being mixed with that after the compressor, through the output bus, through the reverb, and out. So hopefully what will happen, that we'll put in the sidechain, that will drop the threshold or whatever it is that the sidechain does, brings in the compression, and the kick drum and snare drum will remain uncompressed and should shoot through, giving it that clarity while whopping and throbbing its way onto the synths. Now for the sidechain, I'm using an output of Pamela's Pro Workout, which is up here. It's in here, it doesn't matter, you don't have to see it, but all that's kicking out is a square wave, a gate if you like, and that's running at about half time, which is going roughly with the drums, I think. Anyway, let's plug that in and see what happens. Take the drums out. And we're just reducing the pulse width of the gate. there you go. That's pretty effective. Takes a little bit of fiddling around to try to find the best place for that to work. Altering the width of the pulse that's going in. I also tried using the output itself of the drum machine, which sort of worked. Using triggers doesn't. You need to just find there to be enough of a signal going in for it to grab hold of and to use that in order to make that compression happen. And then fiddling around with these two knobs to try to just massage that in. It's not a piece of cake. It's not completely straightforward. You've got to think about it. You've got to adjust and play with things, which is why things like the Kicane, as I've mentioned before, is so well put together, because it really simplifies this whole process. But heck, if you're wanting to do sidechaining in this way, then this is doing it for real. You know, this is the real deal, trying to make that happen. And it certainly adds something and brings, I mean, that throbbing vibe to what's going on is really quite extraordinary. Well, there we go. What do we think? It's been pretty fascinating. I mean, I've been working with this for a couple of weeks now, off and on, and it has this effect of focusing you in on what you're doing. I mean, I rarely finish anything. When I'm patching and creating music and stuff, I enjoy it in the moment, and I'm listening to it through my speakers, but I'm not particularly analysing. I'm not particularly looking to finish something. When I've dropped this into the mix, that changes. I'm now working really closely. I've put headphones on, I'm listening, I'm trying to ascertain what it is that this is doing and what it is that it's offering. And it starts to improve the way that I work. It makes me more conscious of my mixing choices, of what I'm doing, how I'm placing sound. And all the time it's being very forgiving. It's taking whatever it is that I throw at it and it's bringing it together every time. So nothing particularly sounds out of place until I push it too far. And it's that somehow that level of cohesion, that glue that people talk about, the squidgy stickiness that holds things in its space, so that nothing has gone wayward, nothing is tripping out on its own. It's all brought together as a whole. And that's very interesting. And as I've lent more into it, as I've pushed into it, it allows me to really think hard about the sounds that I'm creating. And that in itself is quite a wonderful thing. But you've got to really think of it in terms of your workflow. Does it work in that situation? I mean, it's probably ultimately better if you are streaming out individual tracks into your DAW or into a console or mixer of some kind, then to use proper outboard. But if, like me, you're trying to generate something within the modular instrument itself, then slapping this on the end is just going to bring a level of finish that you wouldn't normally find. I mean, it's going to be fantastic in live performance, because you never know what sort of sound system you're going to encounter once you take your rack out there to an EMOM or to a performance of some kind. And having something which is bringing all of your stuff together, so you've got no wayward big sort of sub-resonant peaks going on, because this is taking care of it. It's bringing that together. And the sound engineer at the live venue is going to thank you enormously for that. So it does have a lot of potential in bringing a proper... what's the word? A proper feeling of properness to your sound, so that you're serving up something which is solid and is going to be under control and is always going to be maintaining and filling that space. I think that's what's important, because in a live performance, people are not hearing you necessarily. You've got something which is cutting through and bouncing off the walls, and other things which are doing other things strangely within the sound, and you can't always monitor exactly what's going on. Something like this is going to keep it together, keep it in its box, which is what you want, because you want to serve the best signal you can out to the audience. And this is a way of doing that. In the day-to-day, it's brilliant. I mean, it's one of those things where when you turn it off, you just go, whoa, what the hell happened? Where's it all gone? Everything's just gone like that. Whereas you want it, oh, you want it on its edge. It's going to like, right, this is exciting. It's full of energy. It's fizzing and it's almost on the edge of destruction. It's going to go. You're going, yeah, I'm going to hit record because this is sounding flipping awesome. And then you bypass it and you go, oh, well, it's a bit middling, really. I don't know. But I think what it will do is encourage you to hit that record button more often, because it is pushing you into believing more in your music because of what it does, because of how it pulls these things in and how it contains it all. It's really interesting. I haven't spent this long on compression for ages. I usually use it very, very sparingly on vocals and bits and pieces like that. And then, you throw on a bunch of ozone on the final mix when you're trying to do your home mastering on these sorts of things. This is very different to that. I'm not just chucking something on and listening to it. I'm mixing into it. And it's that interactivity which is interesting. Because it's not a final process, it's part of your overall process. At least that's been my experience of it. I mean, there are other ways to use compressors, and no doubt the commentary will fill up with ways in which I haven't used it to the way that it should be. That doesn't really matter. What matters is what I'm getting out of it, what you could get out of it, slapping this on the end of your mix. Now, is the Eurobuss going to be better than, say, the Erica Synths one or the Endorphins one or something like that? I don't know, that's really difficult to say. I think that the AudioScape Engineering dynamics and processing units that they do are very well thought of and relatively well priced as well for what they're offering. So bringing that level of expertise and sticking it into Eurorack is worthwhile, I think. And as to whether it sounds like an old British console compressor, I don't have any idea, but it's been a heck of a lot of fun using it. And I feel that I've learned a tremendous amount, not just about how compression works, but also how to get a good sound out of my rig. And ultimately, that's all I'm after. So there you go. Hope that was helpful. In the meantime, go make some tunes.